was really an incredible collaborator in the early days of this project. And ultimately, the story started centering around her experiences when the Center for Investigative Reporting released their very controversial findings about the tube ligations that were happening inside California's women's prisons. And for the first time, even though Justice Now had been working on this issue for over a decade, for the first time, this was a national conversation. For the first time, there was potential for legislation. And that was when Kelly really got called back into the movement to testify on behalf of so many people who wouldn't be able to testify otherwise. And that was the moment that both of us decided we should begin filming her experiences leading up to her testifying. And you know, the rest is really history. I think it's really important to note that without Kelly, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't be having this conversation. There wouldn't be a film. There wouldn't have been the bill or the Center for Investigative Reporting. It's really her courage and her activism that catalyzed this entire investigation, that catalyzed this entire process of discovering how systemic these heinous human rights abuses really are.
Wow. So you mentioned that this took, what did you say, a decade of your life? So you jumped into this film, and how did you think this was going to end? What were you envisioning?
I think in a longitudinal project, I mean, things are always shifting, and things are always flexible in terms of the story. You're following something cinema verite over so many years. The story is bound to shift and change. But one of the things I didn't realize in this process when I first started, obviously Kelly and I weren't collaborating. That dramatically changed the trajectory of the film. I had no idea that the Center for Investigative Reporting would, you know, as a whole would become a character in the film. Corey Johnson would become a character. We would follow a trajectory of a bill. And the aftermath, I mean, really, those weren't ideas, you know, when this film first started. It was really, you know, a character-driven approach to understanding what was going on inside prisons. And then, you know, throughout the process, we're thrust into this unfolding legal drama.
Wow. Yeah, I was really impressed during the movie because I had a lot of experience around jails and prisons, and it still ripped my heart out. I was shocked. I didn't think anything could do that anymore to me. And I was thinking to myself, so here's this filmmaker and she gets an idea. How did you keep your head up during this process? What kept you going?
I will be honest, this was one of the toughest films I will ever make, if not the toughest film. And, you know, the interesting thing about this process is I was always wearing two hats, one as a legal advocate and one as a filmmaker. And this work was incredibly challenging, and I think quite revolutionary in itself to have a film over a decade that was made in collaboration with people inside. This film was made for and with people inside. So what does that mean? When you really break that down, what does it mean? It means that from the get-go, you have to ensure that people inside have access to this film. And so we knew from day one that this film had to be on PBS because, as so many people know, PBS is one of the only consistent channels that people inside have consistent access to. So we knew from the beginning, okay, we have to end up on PBS. We have to figure out a way to get funding to end up on PBS. We have to find a way to get funding that won't jeopardize our broadcast on PBS. It meant that up until the very last minute that we were picture locking the film, that we were consistently communicating with people about what was being said in the film, how they were being represented, how they wanted, if at the very last minute they even wanted to be a part of it, because the threat of retaliation is always a real conversation. And, you know, how do people want to be credited? Maybe someone a year before wanted to be credited by their real name, and now, you know, things have changed. Things are always changing. Do they want to be anonymous? Do they want to have a pseudonym? It meant making major creative decisions in collaboration with a board of advisors inside on every decision, including who would be the musical voice of the film. And, you know, when we got to the point where we were finishing the film, we asked people if there was one artist who could represent your story, who you would want to be the musical voice of this film, who would it be? And everyone hands down said, it has to be Mary J. Blige. So the challenge became, well, how do we reach out to Mary J. Blige and how do we get her involved? And, you know, it's a really interesting story. We hadn't finished the film. We brought on a music supervisor, the brilliant Tracy McKnight. We wrote this letter to her. We sent her the rough cut. She immediately saw the film and said, I have to be involved. But we didn't have an ending. So we had this incredibly synergistic, creative, amazing moment where all of a sudden the reparations movement had momentum. Kelly and Cynthia were going to the Capitol to talk about the need to push this reparations bill forward in California. Mary J. Blige was helping envision kind of this ending that would both inspire audiences to create change, but also acknowledge the weight of these heinous human rights abuses and the legacy of sterilization abuse in this country. And it all came together in that last moment, and we ended up cutting the last scene in the film to that song.
Oh, well, it worked beautifully. It was amazing. I'm going to ask you one more film question, and I'm going to turn to our other panelists and bring them in. But here's my film question for you. The nurse who worked in the prison, I just kind of need to ask you, did you know where she was going? Because her last statement in the film, I was in my office right here watching it on my laptop, screaming at my laptop. Like, what? Did you just say that? Because I thought she was going to be a sympathetic character. And I was wondering if you were shocked or if you knew all along where she was going.
It's a really good question. I was surprised. And in the middle of the interview, and when I took a step back, I think that her opinions really reflect so much of society. I mean, here you have an incredibly sympathetic, very nurturing type of person who has made it her life's work to do no harm, and has working with the most underserved population there is very, you know, concerned about them getting adequate health care. But at the same time, you know, is questioning whether or not she felt like these procedures needed to be offered to begin with, which is a perspective similar to ACOG. But then, you know, took it one step further and illustrated that it's not just one doctor who has these beliefs. It's not just one prison official. It's the entire system that is perpetuating this legacy of eugenics.
Yeah, that was a zinger. It meant a lot to see that, because it really brought home to me how people do carry two lines of thought at the same time without conflict. You know? So now I want to open it up a little bit more to Celinda and Isabella. And basically, I'm going to start with you, Celinda. There's so many issues that affect women. Tell me how this one spoke to you. Why this one for you?
It's so many levels. A little about my story. I was a street kid here in Albuquerque as a young person. I was unsheltered for periods of time. I was in the 90s. You know, we were the super predator kids who were out here. I ended up being a teen mom. I was a mom at just 16 years old. Reproductive justice has always been something that's near and dear to my heart, just because of the access that I had to fight for, whether it was access to birth control, access to abortion care when I was pregnant. Right after I had my son at 16, I went back to my 8-week appointment and I was pregnant again. And so I needed abortion care, and I was just 17 years old. And so I had to seek that care. And so for me, it's something that's been part of my life, part of my own experiences, and has elevated me into the work that I do now. Is as a community organizer for over 20 years now. My most recent work is around Black Liberation Framework, Black Liberation Justice, and I do work under Millions for Prisoners. We are the Southwest IWOC chapter, and we organize with people behind the wall. So I have so much admiration for you lifting the necessity for people behind the walls to be telling us what they need and helping, and us supporting them, and them leading with the narrative of what they want. And so that is what our work is. And we've had our Millions for Prisoners chapter since 2016 here in Albuquerque. It was birthed out of Crystal Roundtree's vision to have 1 million people march on Washington, D.C. In 2016 in the name of prisoners' rights. So we've been doing that work. We organize under Building Power for Black New Mexico. And I also do reproductive justice work in my day job because I can't organize enough in the grassroots. I have a day job as an organizer with Forward Together, which is a social justice, reproductive justice organization. Isabella is my colleague there, and we do reproductive justice work in that framework. So
Can you tell us a little bit more about Millions, what they're doing and what the issues are for them and you?
Yes, definitely. So some of the things that we've worked on, we do a monthly newsletter with prisoners, and we publish their own writings to our broad base, and so that prisoners can share with each other. We do legislative bills. So in 2019, we ran the Ending Felony Disenfranchisement in Voting bill, and our intent was to like 100%, we wanted to get like Vermont and Maine. We wanted no more disenfranchisement for our people behind the walls either, right? Unfortunately, that bill didn't pass, but there's a similar bill that will get us a little bit closer that's being run this session. So we do some legislative work. We've also organized around juvenile lifers. We've organized around the probation and parole bills. Most recently in our work around organizing for Black Lives this year, my partner, Clifton White, became a political prisoner, and he was incarcerated for 6 months in retaliation for our work. So all of those things are intersectional in our Millions for Prisoners work. So we hold prisoners all across the Southwest. We have regular interactions with them. We supported them in the prisoners' strike that happened in 2018, and supporting them in their work strike. We support prisoners from Alabama to Louisiana, all the way through California. So it's really important work. So much, again, Erica, admiration. It is really, really hard work. And there were pieces of the film that just resonated with me. I'm a mom of 6 and a grandma of 1. And my kids have said exactly the same things as were said in that film. My mom's always in a meeting and always stuff all around here. And she cries a lot. She just cries a lot. So, that part of I was just like, yes, this is who we are.
I'm so glad to hear that. I'm so glad that resonated, and thank you for the work that you do. It's really a privilege to share the space.
Isabella, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been doing and who you're working with?
Yeah, so my name is Isabella Baker, and I work with Forward Together Action with Celinda. It's definitely an honor to be here with Celinda and with everybody else here. Watching the film was super powerful for me, but unfortunately not the first time I've seen a film like this where people of color are facing issues like this. And so myself, I started getting involved in organizing when I was about 8 years old. I come from a family of organizers. So we all definitely like get along on that line of, crying together and working all the time, all of that. I started out, and I still do a lot of youth organizing, specifically around like education and anti-racism and anti-racism within like the education system. I started working with Forward Together when I started college, and it was a little bit outside of like what I was used to organizing in, because I did do reproductive justice work within Forward Together, and previously I had done more like student rights work. And so that's when I started working with the folks there and learning more about like what everything was. I had already like been like pretty firm in my understanding of what reproductive justice was and talked about it with the youth that I worked with. I co-founded an organization called Youth Voices in Action in Albuquerque when I was 15 years old with some other coworkers of mine who are also young people. And we have an after school program where we teach young people how to organize, how to self-advocate and all of those things and organize around things that they care about within their schools. And one project we had worked on before is access to reproductive health care within school-based health centers. And so that had been like my, some of like the most organizing I'd done around it before I worked at Forward Together. But being involved and learning more about like all of the things happening within reproductive justice, while also being a Chicano studies major where I was taking classes around Chicano women and the history, and also like the history of forced sterilization for Puerto Rican and Mexican women in the US too. I started to learn more about all of this and seeing how like all of these issues just like really intersect with each other, and how like the system perpetuates racism in like so many ways. And so yeah, I really love the work that I do, and really love like being able to uplift the voices of people, especially like within like changing policy and changing the systems. Me and Celinda were talking earlier about how it's super powerful that we're here today on the day that the archaic abortion ban was finally passed in Santa Fe. And so, yeah, it was like, it just feels so much like the stars are aligning today. And so, yeah, I'm really happy to be here and to talk with you all.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I heard about 15 topics I wanted to follow up on, but I'm going to try and keep myself in tow. I want to kind of open it up to all of you about, well, this is the question that came into my mind just now, so let me throw it out there. One of the themes of the film was, and what Erica has shared with us, was how important it was to have the people of color who were inside, living that experience, having the experience, direct what's going on. Organizations like Santa Fe Now have been around for millennia. I've been around for millennia. And we always grapple with how can we be good allies to younger organizations, to people who have more lived experience, who are coming at it from a different angle than we have. Do you have any advice for us? Any thoughts about that?
Yes, I think the thing that I immediately think about is access. Access to a space like this. You know, our people, we often don't get access to resources, to spaces, to powerful people who are making decisions about our lives. So I think definitely that's something that I'm always advocating with my allies, like, help us get access, help us, you know, whether it's access to a printer to print our newsletter every month to get the letters out, you know. We work in the grassroots with $0, you know, and often the money that we spend to do those kinds of things is coming from our very own pockets, our very own families who we live already in a structure of like what would be considered poverty income. And so, you know, I think that's the best thing that we could hope for is from our allies is help us continue to have access to lift these voices, help us with access to the resources that we need to do our work, the space to do our work. You know, pre-pandemic, it was often difficult to find meeting spaces for us to be able to like manage to hold a forum and like bring in prisoner calls over the phone. You know, we would have to be asking for spaces to do that. So there's, you know, all of the things that are associated with access is the first thing that I immediately think about.
That's very helpful to me because we are a group that has access and you know, we do have connections and we're here. Great. Isabella, what about you? What are your thoughts about how other groups can be allies for young people and young people of color particularly?
Yeah, I think along the same lines of what Celinda was saying, I firmly believe that that advocates and organizers are important, but our work isn't benefiting the people that we're working for if we're not uplifting their voices and having them centered and at the table of what we're doing. A lot of times that can create more harm than good. So I believe that, like, no matter what we're doing, we should always be following the leadership of those that are the most impacted by the situation, and uplifting their voices and giving them the most access over anyone else, because they're the ones most effective. And that's what I believe about young people, especially, who aren't given the spaces to be able to be at the table when decision-making processes are happening. So yeah, that's what, along the same lines of what Celinda said.
Erica, did you want to jump in with that?
Yeah,
your
I'll address it from a creative kind of filmmaking perspective. You know, I think oftentimes the documentary world, the filmmaking industry in general, has been very extractive, and has a history of colonization a part of it. And I think that the important thing for our film community is to really understand that centering the voices of those directly impacted, collaborating with those who are directly impacted, means collaborating. It does not mean having someone involved as a token position, in a token position. That means really understanding, taking a step back, and ensuring that they are a part of the leadership of a project. And I think that that is, you know, essential for our film industry and film community to better understand. And I also just want to say, in dealing with traumatic subject matter, it's incredibly important for those who are directly impacted to guide that process. And, you know, with Kelly and other survivors who were collaborators on the film, you know, they really directed the process as to how much they were comfortable sharing at what point. And, you know, this wouldn't be a film that could be wrapped up within a year. This wouldn't be a film that could take place over a year and a half and would be done. It was essential to be embedded in the movement, to be working alongside those who were, you know, had years of working in the prison abolition community, both in the inside and in the free world, to really understand that work, to pay tribute to that work, and to listen to those who are leading.
It's especially interesting for me to hear this from a director, because directors direct. And it's a big part of your role was to let go of that. Was that hard for you?
Well, there's, I think, a key distinction in understanding that someone directing a process does not necessarily mean they are creatively directing a process. Mm-hmm. And so decisions about big creative kind of milestones or creative processes, how we filmed things, you know, those were ideas that I came up with and asked for feedback on, because I can't expect someone who has never been in a filmmaking role to come up with, you know, how to film something. But I felt it was very important to have everyone whose stories we were telling involved in that creative process in more of an advisory role. You know, I felt a tremendous responsibility to, one, change the way that we visualize imprisonment, because so much of what we see in the media is over dramatized, sensationalized. And I really wanted viewers to experience these vulnerable, uncomfortable spaces and to be asking questions based on what they were visually experiencing. Is informed consent even possible within a coercive environment? And so the conversations I had with survivors about what had happened and what we could visually show, because we didn't have access to a surgical operating room. We didn't have access to an interior cell. We didn't have access to an outside medical contracted facility. You know, how did it smell? How did it feel? What was going through your mind at that moment? And how can we visually translate that? And then once that footage was shot, we were constantly going back and forth, like, how does this accurately depict your experience? Does this accurately depict what other people have described to you? So that's what I mean in collaboration with. In terms of the actual interviewing process, that was really something that was directed by them, how to do that interview, when to do that interview, and to be comfortable ultimately with what was said in the film, for a multitude of reasons. And I have to say that, you know, some of my main collaborators, Kelly and Cynthia, on this film were not filmmakers to begin with, but they gave the most incredible creative advice. The first time that they saw the film, a rough cut of the film, they had seen many fundraising clips along the way. The feedback that they gave was instrumental, was really ultimately what led the film to become a larger than life story, something that wasn't just their experiences, other people's experiences, but really broadened the film, helped bring in some of the more broader eugenics themes. And I'm grateful for that collaboration.
We've got some questions, and the big burning question is, how are Kelly and Cynthia now? What are they up to? Inquiring minds want to know.
Yes. Kelly and Cynthia are both very active in the reparations movement. A new bill was actually introduced this week in California. You can actually go to our website, bellyofthebeastfilm.com, to sign your support on a petition for sterilization survivors. I think this might be the year that reparations finally passes in California, so they're both very active in that sense. Kelly is a commissioner for the Los Angeles Mayor's Office in Family Services, and she's also the executive director of the nonprofit Back to the Basics, which is a community empowerment organization that brings in resources to the community as opposed to the community being forced to seek resources outside. And I mean, Kelly is just probably one of the most brilliant activists in the gang intervention and domestic violence prevention spaces, and sits on many boards of organizations. So support her organization and follow her Back to the Basics organization to see how you can support. And Cynthia is inspiring the next generation of activist attorneys by supporting them through an organization that she's running called the Bay Area Legal Incubator, which is really to provide attorneys who want to do social justice kind of law with the tools and the resources that they need to get their own businesses started.
Great. Well, that did cover some of my next question, which is, what are the projects that are happening that we can jump on board? So we've got a few ideas from you. So Linda and Isabella, tell us specifically the kinds of things, projects. I think it was Celinda, you mentioned youth lifers, young people who are doing life. I'd really like you to touch on that, because I think that's so dramatic and so important. But what other issues are the big issues for both of you right now here in New Mexico?
Yes, and I also neglected to mention that I also organize with another organization called Save the Kids from Incarceration. It's another national grassroots group, and we organize around youth justice issues, school to prison pipeline, and that's another venue for why I'm so involved in this bill, besides Millions for Prisoners. But there's a bill right now in the state legislature in New Mexico. There's about 123 juvenile lifers right now still in prison. Some of them have been there for as long as 40 and 60 years. And so we're still fighting for them to be freed, and we want juvenile lifers to have an additional opportunity, and that we want reconsideration to happen after 10 years. And we also are fighting in that same bill to open up the parole board process. The parole board in New Mexico is one of the most restrictive. It's really amazing to me that I have prisoners in Louisiana who are in shock of the way the New Mexico parole board functions, because even Louisiana has a more liberal parole board process than New Mexico.
I just wanted to say something. Why I laughed is I tried very hard. I got on the parole board. I let out about 3 people and I got fired. So I think that we have a long way to go.
It's all of that. So this bill is intended to do, or the way it's written and framed, is that We want the parole board to be an open process. We want access to legal counsel for all prisoners going to the parole board. We want our families to be able to be present and witness the process. And we want the parole board to be able to be held accountable when they violate civil rights during that process. And so these are some of the mechanisms that are written into this really important bill. And the reason it's connected to the juvenile lifers is because that is who the parole board actually has jurisdiction over. This is the rest of the prisoners. It's sort of like just a process, right? Every prisoner goes to the parole board, but their time's already there and they are eligible for parole. So, you know, when the time's up, you have to go on to a process unless you go on in-house parole. But the lifers is really who the New Mexico Parole Board has direct influence over, who they have the ability and the power to be able to make decisions about. And so this is a bill that's right now pending in the state legislature. We unfortunately are meeting a lot of resistance from district attorneys specifically, who are threatening to kill the bill if we don't make the amendments that they're demanding. And that just feels very undemocratic, you know, that district attorneys get to threaten us about the things that we're fighting for. We would just like due process. We would like our bill to be heard in the committees and be, you know, be decided upon by legislators who are there to make those decisions and not under the threat of district attorneys' offices. So this is where we are on this fight. We're still fighting with alongside prisoners in Louisiana who are fighting for a congressional hearing right now in Washington, D.C. to hear the 10-2. 10-2 is the non-unanimous juries, the history in Louisiana that has existed since Jim Crow. And the prisoners call themselves the living monument to Jim Crow because there are at least 1,700 prisoners that are still incarcerated in Louisiana right now due to the 10-2. So we're still supporting prisoners around that, along with the other multitude of issues, and just really like the grounding on what incarceration is, the carceral system, this system of violence, and helping with political education in our communities to understand the rationale of abolition. We are abolitionists unapologetically. And what we know is that we can never heal violence in our communities using the apparatus of state violence. And prisons and jails and police are violence. So introducing them to a violent situation only perpetuates infinite violence. And we can never, ever heal. We'll never, ever solve the societal problems that we're thinking we can heal with violence. And so we know that women and non-men incarceration is up 700% in the last 20 years. Female prisoners, you know, we know also that most female prisoners and non-men prisoners are there because of systems or conditions that existed because of a man. So we know that patriarchy and toxic masculinity have much to do with female incarceration. And we also recognize and know the harm that happens, particularly to women in prison who are mothers, who are often the center of the family, who are often the one that holds families together, and what that means when we destroy families with female incarceration. And I say also non-men because we represent a transgender community and fighting for the rights of transgender relatives who still don't have access to reproductive justice rights at all across the board, whether it be reproduction and even just in support of their own health, reproductive health. And we still have our transgender relatives being placed into the wrong gendered pods intentionally for violence. We still see this happen, particularly with immigrant justice scenarios where we hear it even right here in New Mexico. In Cibola Detention Center, we had a whole transgender pod, you know, when migrant community was coming for safety, and they ended up in this harmful, dangerous situation, incarcerated here. So, you know, we just really wanted to lift that. And I would like to share also a story about, we help alongside families, and I want to just uplift Shanna her name in this conversation. She gave birth in the Metropolitan Detention Center here in Albuquerque. She kept telling them that she was in labor. She couldn't get assistance. Nobody would take her to medical. And she ended up giving birth in her room by herself with her cellie, only assisting her. And her baby was premature and ended up dying just after birth. And still nobody came. She had to stay in her room with her dead baby during that time. And these are the conditions that our families are in, that our loved ones are in, that our community members are in. In New Mexico, female prisoners are actually punished by being classified. If you go into prison in New Mexico pregnant, you get classified automatically into a level 4 and you get sent to grants because it's a high risk situation. So that's actually a form of punishment when you get sent to a level 4 facility. And so we have pregnant women right now in the grants facility who are in total isolation. And we know that this is not safe for our women. And so there are a multitude of reproductive justice issues surrounding, and particularly in the intersection of incarceration that must be dealt with. And so these are all of the things.
A lot of issues.
Massive work, but we are a massive people, and we have lots of folks with us, and we are continuing to build power, and we are going to continue to knock down these structures of patriarchy and harm as we are trailing our way through.
Yes, thank you. What about you, Isabella? Can you tell us a little bit about the specific things that you are working on and what maybe people might get interested in support?
Yeah, around reproductive justice, we've been working on this, like, repeal the archaic abortion ban for years now. So I'm sitting here trying to think, like, because that's been a big project of ours for a long time. But it still has to pass the governor's desk, and the governor has to sign it. But yeah, that's been a big project of ours. We do a lot of work just around, like, all of the reproductive justice issues. So I would say, like, my biggest advice to people is to follow, like, what the young people are doing and let the young people take lead in all areas of things. And if you're interested in, like, the work that we do around protecting abortion, access, we did something really interesting at Forward Together a couple of years ago, where we do something for Mama's Day every year, and we did one year that was specific towards highlighting mamas in prison. And we do something like that every year, highlighting mamas in different situations, and how the way that families are made up, no matter what the situation is, still makes them a family. And so that's really beautiful, and I love doing that work as well.
Can you tell us how to get those beautiful Mama's Day cards?
Yes.
Those are great. If you want to give a shout out how to get them, now's your chance.
Yeah, you can get them on the forwardtogether.org website around Mother's Day. And we have beautiful postcards. You can send virtual ones that have the art made from our folks with Forward Together that do our amazing art. We also just had art released around reproductive justice and body sovereignty too, that you can find on our website or on our Facebook. Again, Forward Together. Well, on our Facebook, it's Forward Together Action that art is featured on. But we've also been doing work around sex education in schools, and affirmative consent being taught within sex education in schools. We have a bill coming up that'll be in its second committee this week too, where we're doing that work because we believe that affirmative consent can be taught in schools from a young age, and that it really helps to prevent a lot of issues when it comes to sexual violence. Sexual violence, sexual assault, all of those things. And so, that's some of the things that we're doing right now. I'm excited to be a part of all of this. And I think, but I would really like to highlight all of the things that Linda said too, because like her work is super amazing. And I would highly, highly suggest that you guys get involved with Millions for Prisoners. They're amazing.
Great. Erica, are you going to stay involved? You're a filmmaker at heart. Are you going to stay involved in this particular issue, or do you have your eyes on some other prizes?
I mean, I have been in the trenches doing this advocacy work outside of the film for a decade, and I am very involved in the reparations movement and the activism surrounding that. So, you know, I see that the film will live on without me, and the film will continue to be used as a tool beyond, you know, the forced sterilization, as we really look at other forms of modern day eugenics, and how we're witnessing systemic racism and population control through policing, obviously through imprisonment, through, you know, our immigration detention center, and also even broader, who has access to healthcare during the pandemic. So I know that the film will live on beyond me, and as I continue to stay involved in this kind of advocacy work, I am pursuing other filmmaking opportunities, and look forward to having a short film come out in a few months that I can't say much about, but keep an eye out.
That's called a teaser. You know, it occurred to me that when you said the word reparations, that many of the women who are involved in Santa Fe now are children of Holocaust survivors, and reparations has a meaning to them, has a meaningful meaning to them, and that might be one issue that really viscerally speaks to two groups, and maybe could support each other. Something for Santa Fe now to think about.
Yes, I love that.
So I'm going to quick look at the questions here. Mostly the questions are, one of the questions is they want to know about how many women are in New Mexico in the prisons. And I think the number doesn't really say it. I think if you could answer the question, how fast is it growing? It really explains what's going on with our women in prisons. Linda, do you know about that right now?
Yes, like I had shared, female incarceration overall is up 700% in the last 20 years. We're seeing almost like a literal genocide happening to our families right now. You know, I also want to lift into the same conversation, the same narrative around separation that happens when our children are taken from us, whether it be through Child Protective Services or through immigration procedures. But we're often also criminalized in our roles as parents. And mostly it's because of conditions that are not in our control, conditions of poverty, you know, conditions of domestic violence, conditions that we don't have control over, and our children are being taken from us in those same situations that often lead to criminal charges against us. So one of the biggest rises that I've been seeing in my community is women in my community are being criminalized around parenting. Whether it's children right now, they're trying to criminalize parents right now because of the pandemic, and kids aren't logging on to school as they should. And there's a big push right now with Bernalillo County Sheriff's Department just did a big press conference where they are saying that they wanted to go to parents' house when their kids are being reported truant. You know, so we're seeing these big pushes right now to criminalize parents. And we know often that falls on mothers who end up at the center of that. And so whether it be because we're unsheltered due to even conditions related to the pandemic that have really lifted the underlying problems that we've all been facing already with housing insecurity, but those are conditions that we are ultimately criminalized for, charged with felony neglect, felony abuse of children because of conditions that we don't have control over, and then our children are taken from us as a result. We see that in particular with Black families here in New Mexico, who are the most impacted when it comes to juvenile detention and Child Protective Services contacts. So
interesting the way that we're seeing together, because as I said, the two most important rights we have are your freedom, your liberty, and your right to parent the way the hell you want to parent. Those are highly, highly protected rights, and when they affect parenting, they're affecting really the liberty of the whole family. It's really shocking how enmeshed those two issues are. I think Absolutely. It's so great that you've put that together, obviously, and are working on those two tracks at the same time. It's brilliant.
Yeah, we've actually united a lot of the families that were impacted, and some of the findings are really phenomenal in the grassroots work. We're still navigating how we figure out ways to lift their stories, but the one common trend that we see is that often people who were impacted by Child Protective Services or were foster care kids are now their children are impacted. So we're seeing cycles, generational cycles of this impact surrounding protective services or CYFD contact and the removal of children. The other thing that we have seen is that Black families in particular and Chicano families are at the center of a lot of the impact. But also the other thing that we found is this, a lot of the women were sent to the same psychologist that's contracted to the state. And in a 30-minute visit, we're all diagnosed with personality disorder. And that was used against them in court. So that now we have another layer, right, of disability justice. And even if it was true, right, which we're questioning whether or not you can have a diagnosis like that all across the board with all of these women with these short visits. But people with disabilities have a right to parent. So whether it's, it's developmental, mental health, substance abuse is a medical issue, or a physical, disability, like people with disabilities have a right to parent. And we're seeing so many of those intersections also lifting up where people are being criminalized around parenting.
It's so tragic because so many people who are parents, I guess I'm going to say all parents doubt their abilities. And when somebody's telling you you're incapable, that's so undermining, so invasive and harmful, just basically harmful. Well, I want to give everybody a minute to say anything that they didn't get to say and they're sitting there thinking about. Anybody with any questions that they're dying to have answered, now's your time. So Erica, you have any parting words for us?
Just noticed a couple questions about the reparations movement coming in, and I wanted to specify a couple of things specifically about California's reparations bill. There's really three parts of this. One is the compensation for survivors, both who are sterilized in recent, 2-3 years ago in California's women's prisons, as well as those who were sterilized throughout California's historic eugenics program between 1909 and 1979. As you know from the film, California sterilized over 20,000 people. And in the past year, last year, I think there were roughly 450 survivors. And this year now we're down to 380. So this is urgent. It's imperative that we pass reparations now while the survivors are still alive. And I truly feel in regards to California, accountability is a huge part of the process that's missing. There has been acknowledgement of these harms. There has actually been an official apology about California's heinous eugenics history and continual eugenics legacy, but there has never been accountability. And so, when we have accountability, we won't continue to see these instances of forced sterilization continuing to pop up. And in addition to compensating the survivors, there's also a task force who would be in charge of notifying the sterilization survivors that still to this day don't know that they were sterilized. I think that's really important to note that some sterilization survivors still to this day don't know that they were sterilized. And then finally, part of the bill is some sort of memorial that would be placed in a very prominent location to acknowledge California's history so that it may never happen again. And I also really believe that California will set a precedent for other states. That we've recently seen the cases of the mass hysterectomies coming out of the Georgia Immigration Detention Center. And this is really the moment that I think our country, in addition to California as a state, really needs to reckon with the legacy of forced sterilization in the United States and how deeply rooted in white supremacy that really is.
Yeah, I can't believe that California is the only state There's, you know, if
We know
live
for
in
a fact.
California,
We know for a fact that this is happening in other states. In addition to what you see in the film, we sent, you know, dozens of Freedom of Information Act requests to states across the country and know of at least 8 other states that this is still happening in.
wow. Any parting words, Isabella?
Yeah, I think that like the bottom line of like, like watching the film and like the conversation we're having and just talking about reproductive justice in general is that like no one should be able to tell someone when and why they like, or tell them that they can't, have kids or have a family in any situation. It doesn't matter like who they are, where they're from. And I think that like that's really important. And like Erica said, it is urgent. It's an urgent situation, like across the board, the things that are happening to women. And I think when people think about these things, they think like, oh, that's something that stopped back in like the 1900s, and it's not. And I think, we see it in an even more exacerbated way now because of like the more access we have to media and being able to show the world like what's going on. And so, yeah, I think it's super urgent that people get involved and push the systems and the legislators and all of the people to really see that like communities care about this and communities care that women and people have access to like their variety of reproductive health and justice options, and no matter what. And so, yeah, thank you so much for having me here today, and thank you, Erica, for creating this film. It's super amazing, and yeah, thank you so much.
Celinda, do you want to have another minute
Yes, thank
or
you.
3?
There's a few things that I would like to lift also. I just, I know we keep using the term reproductive justice, and I just want to also state the definition of reproductive justice, just for folks who this is a new concept for. Reproductive justice exists when all people have the social, political, and economic power and resources to make healthy decisions about our gender, our bodies, our sexuality, and our families, for ourselves and for our community. And that is what we were talking about when we were talking about reproductive justice. And with that, I do want to lift also, I'm sure, Erica, you experienced this, but also, we've been sharing here, and I said her name, Shauna, and there's so many stories that I could also tell about, around this issue. But we know that our prisoners are retaliated against every time we lift their stories, every time. We've experienced that all through this last year when we've been exposing COVID behind the walls. Our prisoners continue to be retaliated against. And so this is something that is so real. And so anybody who's engaged in reaching out to prisoners or supporting prisoners, please always remember that. And let's all help keep them safe, because that is, we want them to be able to survive, to continue to tell their stories. So retaliation is real, and we need to figure out forms of accountability and holding these institutions accountable for the retaliation, for the practices that they are inflicting on our people. And I've also put a link in the chat here, because this is not over. It's still persistent, and we know that sterilization is happening right now in ICE detention centers. There was a whistleblower that came out of Georgia this year, in the past months, who was speaking about the sterilization of immigrant women in ICE detention centers. And that is being now just exposed. And we understand that that's happening across the United States in detention centers. And so the fight continues. There's still so much more to do. And another piece that I just really want to lift is I want folks to get familiar with the term political isolation. The SC Justice Group did a big study, and they released information surrounding political isolation. It's something that is new and under mental health, and families who are impacted by incarceration. This is a diagnosis that we receive. It's called political isolation, and it's surrounding the conditions, right? What happens to us in the society when we're impacted by the system. the shame, the stigma, the you can't live here, you can't go there. It's very similar to Jim Crow law, right, of what it does. And it creates a second-class society of people who are isolated out of the general system, and they're being erased. And so they have uncovered that the health and the mental health impacts and the physical health impacts of incarceration, even on families, it is under this diagnosis, and our lifespans are reduced to that of a lifelong smoker. And so the carceral system is violent, and I'm going to continue to try to express this. I don't know how much more we can express it, but our lifespans are actually being reduced because of our direct connection to incarceration. And so this is really important for us all to know about. And it's the SC Justice Group. You can find the full reports there. I can also send the links for the full report. But it's really important for us to recognize that, because all of us, allies even in the society, right? What can you do individually, right, to make sure that people feel uplifted and not ashamed, and that they are welcomed back into the society, and that everybody has a place? And how do we start to end this? Because it's the structure, it's the rhetoric that's in the society that trains us to treat folks this way, right? And it's killing us, literally. And so I really wanted to uplift that, because also to help empower those folks. All of us, right, should be empowered who are part of this system, who have been impacted, because those closest to the problem have the best solutions. We know how to solve these problems. And I think it's so beautiful, Erica, the way you've uplifted that in the film, and shown how these women are fighting, and they understand how to tell their stories. They understand what the solutions look like, and you were able to really help them along that path. And that's so beautiful. And the last thing I would like to do is I'd like to share my screen to show our beautiful art piece that Isabella mentioned a few minutes ago, that we are releasing right now with Forward Together. And this is going to be available, and anybody will be able to go on and download it. And it's just the art and the beauty that comes out. And so I hope you can.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if I can add to these people pictured in here are people who are leaders with our organization. We really try to center the leaders and the voices, again, of those most affected. So this is a family, 3 generations, really showing that like intergenerational strength and push for women to have body sovereignty, especially like Native American women and other women of color. So yeah, thanks, Linda, for sharing this.
Thank you.
So
Thank you,
powerful.
Paula. I
And
just want to say one last thing. This isn't a momentous night. That abortion ban is, we came to the finish line. The governor's going to sign it. There's no question about it. We're at the finish line. Abortion for the moment, and I mean for the moment,
the
is
moment.
under control. So take that energy that we've been putting into this abortion battle, and let's spread it out and bring it into the other issues that we've been hearing about tonight. I can't thank you all enough for the work you do, for sharing your time with us, sharing your expertise with us, being willing to take time out of your busy lives to help us understand things better. Thank you, Erica, for this really uplifting film. Shocking, but uplifting. So I'm going to say goodnight. I'm going to thank all the people who attended tonight. You got some places on the chat to click into. Go ahead and click. And everybody have a great, safe, healthy weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.